In today's video, I'm going to show you how I do my fine tuning at distance to take my groups from to really good. If you're new here, my name is Jay Kaminsky. I'm a two-time Olympic silver medalist in the sport of archery, and I have a lot of things on this channel from form to tuning, strength training for the sport of archery, equipment videos, lots of different stuff. So if you haven't by now, hit that subscription button and the notification bell to be notified every time a new video is uploaded. I have a lot of content coming out, and you don't want to miss on what's coming up next. You're watching the Jay Kaminsky YouTube channel. Okay, so today I'm going to cover fine tuning. I've talked about it, saying it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Finally, I'm going to give you how I do my fine tuning. I'm not going to show you because if you remember seeing my last video where I was setting my sight level, it was pretty disastrous. I can't hold my bow at all anymore. 40 something, 45, 46, 48 pounds. I don't remember what it was, but it's way too much for me now. I haven't shot in over 2 years. I mean, for real. So it's just, I'm not going to do that. It's going to be punishing to me, and ultimately it'll be really cringy for you to watch. So I'm going to describe it to you. It's easy anyway, at least it's easy for me to really show you how to do fine tuning. It's not even complicated, but it is absolutely a tool that you should use to your advantage. I've had some people say, well, I'm not a very good shooter, my groups aren't very tight, I don't think it'll make a big difference. It will. I promise you it will, because what you're going to be doing is you're adjusting the bow to work with you and work with your shot, work with your particular setup to shoot the best groups possible. Not to have necessarily the best tune possible, and not to necessarily have the best arrow flight possible. But as far as I'm concerned, if I have a bow that is shooting arrows in a very tight group, I don't care what they fly like, I don't care what the tune's like. All I want to do is have a tight group, because I can always move my sight and make those arrows go in the middle. And if I'm shooting tight groups in the middle, I'm shooting high scores. If your groups are not in the middle, or your groups aren't very tight, then you're not going to have high scores. Pretty simple. So even over the last couple weeks, I've worked with some people on some fine-tuning issues here locally, and I've showed them how to do this fine-tuning, and I actually just described it to them like I'm about to describe you, because ultimately it takes some time, and you know, I don't want to be out there for 2 days straight with them fine-tuning. They did it on their own, and the benefits that they saw were massive, and this was at 60 meters. Their groups were 8-ring, maybe 7-ring width-wise. So they really only narrowed their groups down left to right. They hadn't adjusted the up and down yet. And their groups with 12 arrow ends were smaller than the width of the 10-ring once they got their width down. So they saw a large advantage, and that's very similar for me. After doing this method, I would take a bow and get it from maybe 8.5, a 12, like, you know, midway through the 8-ring, a circular group with 12 arrow ends, and by the time I was done fine-tuning, my groups would be smaller than the 10-ring. So it gives you a massive advantage, and you really can tighten up your groups a whole lot when you're using this method. Now, the way that I recommend to do this is using your plunger tension and either your rest height or your knocking height. You don't change your tiller, and don't change your brace height, because if you change your brace height, it's changing too many factors all at once, and you're really not narrowing it down. So in my opinion, I like to separate the left to right versus the up and down separately, so that way I can just make the tightest, smallest group possible and not even worry about a distortion in the actual group itself. So if this is my target, and it doesn't matter how far I'm shooting, I just shoot a group. Now, I'll just say, and we'll pretend that that was 12 arrows. I'm not going to count them. But if this was 12 arrows, what I do is I automatically discount the furthest left and the furthest right. I don't know if that's mirrored for you. It might be. This is my left and your right. I don't know. But anyway, I discard the furthest left and the furthest right arrow, and I no longer pay attention to that, just in case I made a mistake, the wind was blowing, whatever. Optimally, you should do this not when it's windy, or not terribly windy at least, and work on your group sizing. But I discard and ignore those outliers, because what I'm going to show you is how to adjust your left to right groups first. So I actually pull one of those arrows out. I ignore the other one on the opposite side, and I will take my arrow and I line the point up with the furthest left and after discarding that one, and grab the furthest right, and then I will take a pen up on the top of the target, and I will say that my arrow or my group width is this wide, and I use my arrow, like I said, left to right like this. So you can see that's how wide my group is. Now I shoot two ends and do this for two ends to make sure that my group is somewhat consistent and I'm getting about the same results as from end to end. Obviously some ends get really tight and some ends don't, so you might take the average of those two ends, but generally for me I'd have a consistent-ish group. We'll just say this next one was a little wider, a little bit wider. Now the next end, after shooting two ends, I take my button, my burger button, my plunger button, whatever you want to call it, and add 3 clicks. 3 clicks generally is enough. You don't really have to do more than that. I wouldn't do less than that because it's just not enough. And you add 3 clicks or remove 3 clicks, whichever direction you feel like trying first. Honestly, it doesn't matter because say if I added 3 clicks and this was my group, I discard the furthest right and the furthest left. I now measure. You can use your bow square, but it's just a pain in the butt in my opinion. And my new group is this wide. So my groups got worse. So what do? Well, if I added 3 clicks, I think that's what I said, I'm going to remove and take those 3 clicks off and then take 3 more clicks off. Now you can, in general, I always recommend shooting 2 ends just to confirm that this isn't a fluke. But usually you'll really, really see if you're moving the wrong direction because it will get much bigger, much quicker. So I take those 3 clicks off and take 3 more clicks off. And now my group, take the left and the right out. And looks like now my group is much tighter. So my group's tighter. I'll do that again, shoot another end. It's consistent. So it definitely got smaller. I'll take 3 more clicks off. It gets smaller. I'll take 3 more clicks off. It gets smaller, and then all of a sudden, after the 3rd or 4th round of taking clicks off, my groups are no longer tightening up anymore. So what does that mean? In my opinion, what I have seen, this fine-tuning method, you'll end up having this type of a shape of performance, basically. So if this is your click range of stiff and this is weak, doesn't matter. It can be interchangeable, whatever's yours is. As you make 3 clicks, you're going to really start seeing a lot of gain, a lot of benefits. Your groups are really going to start tightening up. But then as you start getting closer to this plateau, you're going to see less and less benefit. If you were to continue more, you'd eventually start losing performance as well. So I find that it plateaus. And once it plateaus and doesn't get any more tighter than this, I stop. And I'm done with my tuning left to right. So I can stop paying attention to that. And then next, I shoot my groups. Now it's tighter left to right. The up and down's a little off. I take the upper one and the lower one, and I do my measurement again, and we'll just say that it was this wide, or this tall rather. So I shoot another end. Remember to do 2, and it's consistent. Great. So the next thing that I do is I take my my arrow rest and I bump my arrow rest either up or down if I have a movable arrow rest, which I always use a movable arrow rest for this reason. I always chose the Shibuya one, super easy, unless I was shooting indoors and I was using these bigger ones, the Free Flight Elite or something like that from AAE. But anyway, I bump my rest either up or down, doesn't matter, and just use the same principle. You shoot 2 more ends, 2 more ends, 2 more ends, 2 more ends, and then all of a sudden it's tight. And it doesn't tighten up anymore. I've hit a plateau. That's my fine-tuning end, and I'm done. However, sometimes you can go back and forth, left to right, as you gain benefit. These might open up a little, so you tighten that back up, and so on, and you can really tighten your group down. And no lie, I can tighten up a 12-arrow group in real life from this big. Shooting 12 arrow ends, you take away the furthest right and the furthest left. This used to be how big I would start with, and I would end up with a 10 arrow group because it was 12 arrows, discarding one left, one right, one up, one down, whatever. And I'd have a group about this big, smaller than the size of the 10 ring. I found this to be a huge advantage and it gained me tons and tons and tons of points. Now, something to consider is if this was your plunger tip right here, and your arrow was sitting in the center, and you bumped your rest down, you bumped your rest down and down, and now your arrow's almost not on the plunger anymore, but your groups are still tightening up, what do? Well, what I do is, if this is my knocking point right here, I measure my knocking point drop, and we'll just say this is a 1/2 inch. It's a 1/2 inch high, or whatever metric you want to use. So what I do is I measure it, I figure out what my knocking height is, and then I recenter my arrow. You can either recenter it, or what I do is I move it back up to the top where it's just on, because I'm going to continue moving down. But then I measure my knocking point, and I retie my knocking point a 1/2 inch above this new setting. And then I continue my fine tuning and keep bumping down and down until it plateaus, and my final setting happens to be wherever it ends up being. I use the arrow rest because it's much easier to move the arrow rest than it is to retie knocking points, because by this time in my tuning, I should already have permanent knocking points tied on my string. If you haven't seen that video on how to tie knocking points, I'll put a card at the top, and there'll also be a link in the description below. So after you're done fine tuning, what I do suggest is go back to 30 meters and shoot some flet shafts and bare shafts again. Now, in the beginning of this series, I talked many times about what is a rough tune. And I knew what my rough tune was. I knew what I was comfortable with. I knew what my final tune was, because after I do my fine tuning, I always went back to 30 meters and I shot some bare shafts and flet shafts and wrote down and made a note as to where my bare shafts impacted relative to my flet shafts, to basically have a list or a data sheet of every single setup. I would write down everything that I had, the arrow length, the point weight, the bow, the limbs, you name it, everything. Go down the list and make note of where the best groups were with whatever tune that resulted. So that way when I did my preliminary tuning, my preliminary setup, I would set it up so my bare shafts hit where I knew that my previous bow shot the best at with that fine tuning setup. So that way it only took maybe an hour to 2 to 3 hours to do my fine tuning, as opposed to 2 to 3 days. Now, the person that I just recently worked with on helping him set up his bow and talk to him about fine tuning, he said he had to adjust his plunger 1.5 turns, and it made the arrows group phenomenal. You know, it changed the way that they flew. They weren't flying as good, but again, what I'm saying is you would rather have a tighter grouping arrow than a better flying arrow, in my opinion. Also, if you're interested in any sort of coaching, I'm doing digital coaching through Skype or something along those lines, as well as I'm doing coaching locally, and you can find out information on that and where to book at my website, jkaminski.com. I'll put a card up at the top, plus there'll be a link in the description below, so if you're interested in that, check that out. Thanks for watching, and thank you to my Patreon supporters. If you want to become a Patreon supporter or check out books, apparel, and some seminar info, head to jkaminski.com, and be sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to be notified every time a new video is uploaded. And I appreciate you watching. Thank you again.